Hello, I'm Charles Clausen, your host of the AMPx Podcast, a show where we engage in conversations with entrepreneurs and innovators whose wild ideas and exponential thinking are reshaping the universe where we live, play, and work. I believe these powerful conversations will inspire you to pursue your dreams. So we're excited to have Sean Kennedy with us today. Sean is an entrepreneur, an innovator, a naturalist, a geologist, and a political operative. So welcome, Sean.
Well, thanks, Charles. Great to be here. Great to see you again.
You know, it's just for a little background. Sean and I have known each other for over 5 decades, probably now. So we go way back to when we were in single digits and young kids growing up in the same neighborhood.
A long time ago. Great neighborhood, great group of kids, and it was, there must have been 2 or 3 dozen guys relatively our age within a 10-block radius, so we had a lot of fun.
Yeah, a lot of us are still good friends today, so those friendships have lasted a lifetime. So I think I'd like to start, when I do this with every one of our guests, is going back to when you were young. What inspired you with the creativity and the innovation to drive all your diverse interests? I mean, you got a lot going on, my friend.
I think growing up in a university city really made you realize that a lot was possible. There was a lot of dynamic people in our lives growing up here. A lot of us were professors' kids, and we saw the people that were coming and going into the city, into our family lives among their grad students. At least my dad's grad students came from all over the world. I'm not sure if your father had an international group of students, but if that was a good exposure, my father traveled a lot, so I knew the world was possible. But I really think another commonality is you'd already stepped out of our Boy Scout troop by the time I entered it, but we had 2 or 3 geology professors, I think at one point geology professors who were scout leaders, and we had the most incredible field trips that we got to see, go caving and spend the night in caves and go looking at fossils and really a wide range of outdoor activities, and I think that helped me bud as a naturalist. We also lived on the edge of town, so getting out into the woods, I know you guys were older, but you were out building forts, and we emulated you, and we were really all budding and naturalists and outdoorsmen without really knowing it. So I think that created the foundation, both coming from an international community with interesting people coming and going, and then being exposed to a lot of natural things.
Well, it certainly played a big role in my life. Nature was between Boy Scouts and every day after school heading out into the woods and hanging out in nature. Maybe we should start with the international aspect of what's going on in the world and some of the creative things you're doing and serving people in the Ukraine, and some of the energy work you're doing over there, also trying to help the people have power and some heat and keep critical functions going this winter.
So my career, as you mentioned, is quite broad, but in some ways it's bifurcated in that some of it comes out of my interest in public service, and that leads me to politics and the things I've done in politics and working with nonprofits and other groups that are I'd say progressively orientated for the most part. Then the other part is science and technology, being a geologist. But the way I ended up being able to travel, both was originally with my family, but then I went to a geology field camp one summer in Switzerland and Scotland and got to explore Europe a bit on my own. And then I went to be an exploration geologist, but I took a leave in '92 from working in Utah as a geologist to work for Bill Clinton just for a short period. Well, my job on the campaigns was being what's called the advanced staff, the people that fly in ahead, set up the rallies. They look like, they just magically happen, but there's a huge amount of planning very quickly. And when you talk about being able to think on your feet and be innovative and creative and put things together that are different than any imaginative, that was good work, good seed work for that. But in any event, I went on to the U.S. Department of Energy as a political appointee. But once a month or every 6 weeks, I get lent to the White House when the president was traveling. So if he was going to somewhere like, in this case, Ukraine, I'd go on the team. And the team had a bunch of different people doing different jobs. But mine was being the designer, producer, director of the big event. And probably one of the 3 or 4 biggest crowds we ever had for Bill Clinton was in 2000 in Ukraine, and that was right in front of Mykolaiv Cathedral, which you always see in the background of like the CNN reporters, the gold domes there. We had a 200-person possibly a crowd there, and it was magnificent. I made some great contacts, and I managed to go back a few years later with Bill Clinton as ex-president. When he went, they'd call me occasionally to go put together his trips as ex-president. I was hired by Earth Day Network, who's one of my clients in my sort of political media world, to put on the first Earth Day concert ever in Ukraine. And down in Maidan, where all the big protests happen, I produced a huge concert with some of the biggest bands in Ukraine. And then after the Orange Revolution, when President Yushchenko, who emerged out of the, basically became president after the Orange Revolution, his people hired me when he came to Washington, D.C. in the square that's named after their poet, Shevchenko, who's the national poet of Ukraine. We did an Orange Revolution-style rally for all the Ukrainians living in the region came to it. So I had a deep connection to Ukraine, and when the war started, of course, I wanted to do something, which is, I guess, what those that can do. And I was watching TV and I saw World Central Kitchen was setting up there. World Central Kitchen was founded by Jose Andres, a very well-known chef out of Washington, D.C., who now has about 30 restaurants. And he goes into disaster areas with his team, and they bring in other celebrity chefs, essentially, and they set up field kitchens, and they organize feeding masses, very high-quality food, comfort food for the people that are there. So you wouldn't be making, the perfect burrito in Ukraine, you'd be making the perfect bowl of borscht. And they flew in a field kitchen that had 8 paella pans that were bigger than this table. They were at least 2 meters across. Each one of them could hold, I think it was 1,800 bowls of soup. They had 8 of these things running full time, and then were shipping food all up and down the border and pushing out, tens of thousands of meals a day. Wow. So I volunteered with them, and that's sort of the beginning of the short beginning of the Ukraine story with me.
So you started out serving people of Ukraine food and helping prepare high quality food, and that led to other endeavors to help with big power generators, bringing them in from outside of Ukraine to help run critical functions, or what was that all about?
Well, I was happy to be there for 2 weeks slicing and dicing right when the war started. Most of the refugees were coming out. But I also thought I might be able to create a little media attention or help with fundraising. I did do a GoFundMe and raise about $30,000 while I was there, but to help with the Ukraine effort. But World Central Kitchen raises money. Jeff Bezos at the time wrote a $100 million check to them. They really didn't need my help in one of my two areas of expertise. And I was happy to slice and dice, but I knew I wanted to do more. So I went back for 2 weeks in August and toured through 3 cities before I was on the border in Ukraine, and looking for an organization that needed my help in what I traditionally do. I'm a not that great of a cook. I shouldn't be.
So you're an
spending my time
organizer?
with that. Yeah, I'm more of an organizer. So bottom line is I found a group called Vostok SOS that had been formed right after the 2014 invasion of the Russians in Crimea and the Donbass. They were all internally displaced people. Basically, they were refugees within Ukraine. The Russians were occupying their area. And they put together an organization to aid other internally displaced people. So they do everything from feeding. They produce 1,000 boxes a day with the supplies for a family of 3 for 2 weeks. They are running several shelters and camps. They have, at the time I was there, they were just opening 3 shelters for women that have been through some of the worst of the worst. They've got a hotline manned by 4 people 24/7 with lawyers, psychiatrists, people that can solve any problem. They're doing extractions, buildings on the front line. So it's an elderly person on the 5th floor or a disabled person. They'll send a van and a team to carry them out and get them out, or else they'll send a whole buses up to the front lines to pull people out that need to come out. They were very amazing. They just raised $2 million in Estonia, and they hadn't raised a dime yet in the US. And I thought, well, if they can raise $2 million in Estonia, where I believe you had a grandmother from, maybe.
Right.
And we probably can do at least that well here. So I'm in the process of forming a 501c3, which will be called Vostok SOS USA, and we're in the last part of selecting a board for it, and hopefully we'll have an operating 501c3 nonprofit in the U.S. to raise money and awareness for Vostok SOS.
So were you actually on the front lines in places that were getting bombed or had been bombed?
No, I was in Kyiv, Lviv, and Uzhhorod in August. So probably the closest bombing actually when I was on the Polish border feeding people a couple days after I got there, and coming in with me were a bunch of foreign volunteers coming to fight. Well, the training camp was just over the border, and this was in March. It's a little like 2 weeks after the war started, and that camp got bombed. That's the closest, I think it was 8 or 9 miles actually away from where I was. Closest that I know of a bomb hitting when I was there. But I did wake up my first morning in Kyiv to air raid sirens, and there were 3 or 4 a day, but there was no active bombing in any of the cities I was in while I was there. So I did go up and look at a friend of mine from when I produced the Earth Day concert, lived in Irpin, which was about as far south as the Russians' northern offense made it. And I went, their apartment had a rocket-propelled grenade go through the apartment below them and above them. And they fortunately both, she and her husband worked for Western companies, so they were able to get their apartment. They had some money to do it, but if you don't have money, there's no insurance policy to rebuild your apartment. There's no government money for that. It is tough. So their building's a mix of people putting windows back in and people just putting plastic up, and I imagine this winter's really tough for them.
I imagine. I don't know how many people have lost their homes or are on the streets as a result of all this, but it's got to be tough there in winter.
Well, it's millions of displaced people. I want to say it's about 12 million internally displaced and 12 million have left the country, or at least that was a few months ago.
So
and
a
maybe
total of 24 million?
Yeah, about
out of 40 million in total?
Yeah, 45 million, yep.
That's
a lot of people are on the move. And, 20% of the land is, if their land right now is occupied by the Russians one way or another, whether it be through the 2014 invasion or this. So it's substantial. It's a big country by European standards.
Well, they have tenacity and commitment and fierce fighters. I mean,
Yep.
Doesn't sound like they're giving up anytime soon.
Yep.
And if we would give them more weapons and more tools, they could probably be more effective and
Yep.
cut down on some of the damage.
And there's numerous tracks to help out. There's the humanitarian side. Of course, the U.S. government's doing a good job on arming them, but needs to do more. And training, as well as the European Union and much of the world, I think, has come come in support of Ukraine. And then there's the other part that started in October, and that's the destruction of the infrastructure. And my particular interest is in energy in a number of my different endeavors. And when they started blowing up the substations and cutting off power to people, I decided that might be an area where I can help as well. So I've gone on to begin working to source electrical equipment, generators, transformers, switchgear, lines for Ukraine, and working with the U.S. government, trying to work out a mechanism to use U.S. funds to pay for it. Now, we haven't gone there yet, but one of my main businesses is solar energy development. If I order a transformer for a large solar project now, what people think of as a solar farm, I'll be told it's a 3-year wait for a transformer to go in the substation that we'd have to build for that solar farm. So you can imagine if you have dozens and dozens of substations that are being blown up, you either have to rebuild those transformers if you can, which often you can't, or else you've got to wait for new ones. So the power is not coming on tomorrow, even if the war ends then. It's going to be a long time. There's big companies like Siemens and General Electric and all that are, I'm sure, being contracted right now to rebuild the grid over time. But there's a whole lot of Band-Aids that are going to be needed between now and the years to come. So I've been working on, you can find equipment, but who pays for the equipment? Obviously, the Ukrainians are pretty strung out financially, having to operate in this, run a major war against the Russians. So they aren't paying for it. And then the European Union has offered to pay for it. There's groups like the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. They're likely to fund the government-owned transmission company, but the local distribution companies that provide power to your home, they can't access that money. It's fairly complicated how you get money in. Now, the Biden administration has made 2 pledges, one of $55 million, another one of $53 million more recently. The Secretary Anthony Blinken announced in Romania a few weeks ago. The reality is that doesn't buy you much in the way of transmission equipment or generators. That's very, very expensive equipment, but it's a start.
Are these portable transformers or are these fixed?
We're looking at, drive by a big substation that operates,
On a semi.
Yeah, these things are, sometimes half as big as this room. Anywhere from as big as, the smaller ones would be from the back of our chairs to here. They're ones they aren't the kind that hang on a pole that you see that almost look like a soda can up there. Sometimes 3 of those.
These are big boxes that sit on concrete platforms.
Yeah, exactly. And there's major amounts of wiring. They're basically a series of coils is what they are to convert voltages. So they're the ones that take the high voltage, step it down to a lower voltage that can be distributed out through the system. You blow those up. If you destroy these wound components, that's miles of wire that has to be rewound and all. So what I've been working on is I've met with high-level people at the U.S. Department of State. I'm in contact with the main distribution company and transmission company in Ukraine. We're communicating with the Ukrainian First Lady's office. Today I made contact with their Minister of Energy. We made contact. Unfortunately, Christmas landed right in the middle of this effort with the people at U.S. Department of Energy that are dealing with this, trying to figure out where to get equipment, how to pay for the equipment, and how to get it there, and who will receive the equipment when it gets there. So there's a bunch of pieces. It's a fairly new effort. So I can't tell you how it works out, but it's certainly worth trying to do some good with it, and hopefully maybe use the next 10 years of my energy career being involved in rebuilding the electrical infrastructure in Ukraine.
So you were over there in year 2000 supporting the Clinton administration engagement he was doing over there. Do the proximity to any of those relationships help you with what you're trying to do today in the Ukraine? And are you still friends with some of those people you developed friendships with 20 plus years ago?
There's friendships that grew out of those friendships. For instance, if we had one of these huge Clinton events, usually because so many people have to go through the metal detector, it can take hours and people are standing there on the street. So you try and give them something to do and to create atmosphere and all. I'd often produce a concert as part of it, have a couple band stages there and switching out bands. And it was novel enough in those countries at the time that it would be a live television program there, essentially. There's a guy named Joseph Lemire I met who had an American-owned radio station in Ukraine in 2000, and he provided the DJs and helped us book the bands. Wonderful guy. He's no longer in Ukraine, but when I went back to produce the Earth Day concert, he was very helpful then. And so one of his guys who worked for him then is my contact working with the First Lady of Ukraine's office, a guy named Yuri, and a great guy. I was talking to him today as I was walking through Wilson's Orchard. And so that's one contact. Another guy named Morgan Williams is the head of the US Ukraine Business Council. I believe I met him when I worked on President Yushchenko's visit to Washington. It might have been before that, but sometime in there. I didn't meet him on the original trip, but it's sort of those first contacts led to other contacts. The US Ukraine Business Council obviously is very helpful on the matters I'm working on. So, yeah, relationships are beyond one person. They're the people those people bring in. And
just whole networks of people.
Yeah, it really is
engaged.
Networks of people. And I met with the Chief of Staff to the Secretary of State. I know her from about this initiative in Ukraine. Well, I know her from the Clinton days when she worked for Madeleine Albright, right? Just a much junior position, more or less parallel to where I was. And we kept in touch. And when she was with the Albright Stonebridge Group, she, helped Madeleine Albright start her company. Well, then when I had a previous company, Summit International Relations, we had numerous things we needed help from, and Albright Stonebridge stepped in and helped us out with it. So, these are lifetime, like us, it's lifetime relationships. When you can create enough friendship and goodwill and be open to helping people out, often they'll be there to help you. So.
Excellent. So when you joined the Department of Energy, how did that appointment happen, and how did you find your way into the energy segment?
Well, it wasn't direct to solar energy, I'll tell you. My background had been as an exploration geologist, and there was, in the 1980s, a big gold boom in Nevada and then into Utah, something that were called Carlin-type deposits. And there weren't a lot of geology jobs at the time, and I was very lucky to get into that game. But I worked throughout Nevada as an exploration geologist. The thing I like about that job is it has explorer in the title, which I always thought just kind of made me feel good. Not a lot of people get paid to be an explorer. But I did really roam much of the backcountry in Nevada in my 20s, and got paid to hike around and look at rocks, which is kind of like a Boy Scout's dream, I guess. And I was very happy to do that. But the Department of Energy had an initiative to dispose of all of our civilian radioactive waste. Probably a lot of people don't know we've never disposed of a single fuel rod in our 70 years of having civilian nuclear reactors. They're all sitting there where they were generated. Well, we were studying, the U.S. Department of Energy was studying a place called Yucca Mountain, which was on the Nevada test site where all the nuclear testing happened. And those strata, those layers, I knew from another place, having worked in that region of Nevada, it was kind of cool, but I'm not sure anybody in the political world knew that. Coming out of the leave I took from the mining business was for 3 months doing this showbiz side of politics.
Mm-hmm.
They flew us all to Little Rock for election night, and I was going to head back to Utah, where I was working at the time, living in Salt Lake City, which is pretty good duty for a geologist. And a guy on election night said to me, Sean, I'm going to get something really big on the inauguration in Washington. I want you to come work for me. And I thought, well, that would be cool for a couple months. I still didn't know there were low-level political appointments, so I called my boss, and he was happy not to have another field geologist in the middle of the winter in the office, and gave me another couple months leave of absence, and I went to work on the inaugural. I got to Washington, and everybody's talking about what they want to do in the administration, and I learned about Schedule C political appointees, which are really the support staff, or the cabinet members and the assistant secretaries and all. And I thought, well, if you knuckleheads are going to get a political appointment, I better see if I can.
Well.
I can't get one. So there's something called the Plum Book, which used to be a published book. It's now on the internet. There are all the political appointments. So I got it from the National Bureau of Imprinting. I think it's where he got it from at the time, which happened to be in D.C. Copy of the Plum Book, and it looked like Department of Interior is probably where I belonged if you looked at my interests and what I'd done at that time. But it takes many months. It's not like the inauguration's over. These lower level positions don't get filled in until the upper level positions get in. I actually went back to Utah and worked a couple months, and then suddenly they wanted me to go interview at Department of Energy, and it happened to be the Office of Civilian Radioactive Waste Management. And I don't think anybody that sent me there knew how perfect that was, given what my background was. It's just, but the head of the director was a guy named Dan Dreyfus. And Dan had been chief of staff for the House, I want to say it's Energy and Natural Resources, that might be the Senate name, but the equivalent. Mm-hmm. And he'd retired, and he was brought back to take on this almost impossible project of radioactive waste, came out of retirement to do it. And I learned so much from him. I feel like the biggest role I played in his life was to come in his office at 6 p.m. and sit at his conference tables. He wound down for the day, told me stories, but he was really a guru and really understood politics and how to make things happen. And I learned so much. So that's how I landed at Department of Energy. And then through the 8 years, I zigged and zagged and ended up on the staff of the secretary and did other things along the way.
So as a staffer on the Department of Energy leadership team, where did that take you? What did you learn?
Oh, so much. I mean,
they'd throw big problems at you and say, go figure this out, or what is that? What's a day in the life of a senior staffer look like?
It depends where you were. I was put on a team for a while to study the nation's nuclear weapons program. You don't think of it. Most people don't. I understand that Rick Perry, when he became Secretary of Energy for Bush, he didn't even know that the nuclear weapons were at Department of Energy at the time. And a lot of people that call, including Rick Perry, for the shuttering of the Department of Energy don't understand that. But that's where a huge part of the budget is. Well, Vice President Gore was running a reinventing government program, mm-hmm. and they had every department basically do a self-study and suggestion of how to downsize and streamline. And I was asked to go, because I knew what a radioactive nuclide was anyway, which got me better than a lot of people. You couldn't study your own area, but I was asked to go into the cluster that studied defense programs, mm-hmm. and that was an amazing experience in that I got to go to all, the U.S. Department of Energy labs and talk to all the senior people, the head of the different labs, people running different programs. The things I learned were incredible. I got to listen to the father of the H-bomb, Edward Heller, play the piano. I saw him in the restaurant at Los Alamos Laboratory and thought, God, I know who is that? My partner and I were working on our notes from the day, and the older gentleman walked into the bar in the restaurant, and we're playing piano in there. You can hear it, and it's just beautiful piano. And we ended up checking out the next morning. People are like, yeah, Edward Teller was playing the piano all night in the bar. You guys should have gone in there. I'm like, the brush with greatness. But getting back into what you learn being a staffer, I mean, there's so many of those stories, both in my White House work and my DOE work. So much of it is really special projects. You're flying high. Often, the cabinet member or the assistant secretary, they don't have time to get down into the minutia and being there at the moment and understanding the minutia. A lot of what I did was talking to the US Geologic Survey, who's doing a lot of the study of Yucca Mountain when we were looking at that. But then later on, I can give you examples of, traveling with the Secretary of Energy when I went to work for the Secretary and just being there. Sometimes you're being almost like a footman in that Harry Reid, Senator Reid from Nevada, once said to me after we were the secretary, and he spent all day on the Nevada test site looking at the nuclear, testing facilities and going through it. And I'd go a day before and walk through and meet with everybody that they had to meet with. Walking through that, and my job is really to cut off the meeting and keep everybody running. So sometimes it's very logistics and functionary like that. But Harry Reid said to me at the end of the day, "You're the nicest rude person I've ever met," which, and if you talk to people that know Senator Reid, he was not big on compliments, but it was, like having the ability to walk in and cut things off.
Keep things moving.
Keep things moving is a little bit of part of being a staffer, but really knowing what's going to happen, what's going to be talked about, what's going to be said, understanding enough so you can usually, if you're with whoever your principal, we call them the principal, but whoever your person you're working for, to be able to brief them before with enough content that they can get through the meeting. Now, there's often a policy expert there if it's something very complex, but knowing enough to head off problems or understanding what they should see or not see or who they should talk to is part of it anyway.
So, when you left politics, did you go into the energy entrepreneurship business and solar power, and where did your path take you next, Sean?
Immediately, when Clinton lost his job, we all lost our job. I needed to make some money, and I had very good contacts among Democrats, nonprofits, and trade unions, and I had a reputation on this media production side. So immediately I set up Sean Kennedy and Associates Media and just, got things cranking. Unfortunately, 8 months into having that business, or 7 months, we had the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center, et cetera, which made
a big damper on all kinds of
everybody's business. It was a rocky road. It was a little while before I realized I probably did not want to spend my life with just a media business. It's interesting, it's fun, it's useful, and it certainly gets you in right circle politically to do other things. But it wasn't my intent when I studied geology, and science was always a big passion and interest of mine to only do a series of satellite uplinks and media events and whatnot. So I was looking for something else to do, and by 2004 I settled on the idea of working on Romania and Bulgaria as they entered the European Union. And it was clear that huge amounts of European Union money was being spent there. There were whole sectors that had not been developed, everything, whether it be from real estate to renewable energy. Communism had left a very dilapidated infrastructure, and there were a lot of things of highways whatnot to be rebuilt. So I formed a partnership with, once again, part of this networking thing. I'd originally met a man named Petre Roman, who was the first prime minister of Romania after the Romanian Revolution. When I was over in Romania in 1997 with Clinton, and actually it was through other contacts that knew him previously that I had a chance to spend time with him in 97. And when I went back on Clinton's book tour, probably in about 03 or so, I had lunch with him, and he'd been prime minister. He'd run for president of Romania 3 times with diminishing returns. He was a non-corrupt guy, very corrupt country, and really hadn't made any money. And he was asking me about, well, Madeleine Albright, for instance, what does she do to make a living in her retirement? What Sandy Berger, other people that I knew or had worked around or with. And I explained generally how a firm like we mentioned Albright Stonebridge works and who their client base is and what kind of things they facilitate. He seemed to be well placed. He'd also been Romanian foreign minister after he was prime minister to develop a company like that. So we started a company together called Summit International Relations, primarily to facilitate forming financial and strategic partnerships for projects in the Balkan and Black Sea region with an emphasis on energy, but we got pulled into a lot of different things in that world.
So your all your project management experience, did that come in handy with what you were trying to do there? And
well, it was different, but I think it's the same set of skills. It's, doing these things, whether it's going into a new country in Eastern Europe, there's a bit of scrounging that goes on. I hate to say it, but a lot of what I've done through my life is going and finding the people and the things that can make something happen. So scrounging through my relationships. So if a solar developer or wind was really getting going about the time, there's big EU incentives about the time Romania and Bulgaria were joining. So people wanted to develop wind. They knew there were good incentives. They weren't sure who could finance it or where to get the equipment at all. Then I could scrounge through my relationships and bring the right people to the table to work with them. Is that organizing compared to like developing a solar project like I am now? It's different set of skills. It's a lot of.
It sounds like you're a network entrepreneur where you're just leveraging relationships and contacts and networks to capitalize on current opportunities wherever they might be in countries of interest where you've spent time in the past. And
yeah, at that stage I wasn't a full-fledged developer at that stage. When I really switched over to being a full-fledged developer was when, as things started to slow down in Romania and Bulgaria after the 2008 economic collapse sort of rippled through in the beginning of 2009 into Europe.
Right.
A lot of what we were working on and we're making big progress on just died. The EU incentives went away, or building we were involved in a logistics center that we brought the investors in that was going to be built at the Bucharest airport. A lot of that stuff just died and unclear what to do. Well, I'd been meeting with the largest distiller of alcohol in Romania. They wanted to move into the fuel ethanol business. They thought of themselves as great distillers, which they were. And there's a lot of bootlegging in Romania, and as the economy gets worse, people go back to making their own plum brandy and all, and they were looking for a way to grow and expand. So I tied into some other entrepreneurs that were trying to develop Iowa-style ethanol plants on the Danube. They were working up in Croatia, and their project they'd lost their investor in their project, and the project was essentially dead in the water. And we came up with this idea to build 3 projects, one in Croatia, one in Serbia, and one in Romania. The ones that was Prodvin Alcohol was the name of the Romanian company. Not that that matters, but it was their concept. Would become part of this bigger package and build 3 ethanol plants. So, but they'd given up after they lost their investor, the folks that had the Croatian project, and basically told me, if you can get this thing going, we'll bring you in at the level we are in it. And so I was de facto project manager for 2 years for an ethanol plant that never got built. But that's really when I stopped working for developers and building relationships for developers and really became a developer myself.
So tell us about that. Where did that becoming a developer take you next, Sean?
Well, I'd had clients that were in numerous areas of renewable energy. I was very interested in continuing to work on things I felt were important and cared about. I also have a lot of government relations background, and when I decided to start my own development company, which is the one I have now, Megawatt, it's Megawatt Photovoltaic Development, it was going to be developed solar here. If you look at what has happened to solar pricing, if you strip out what's happening with tax credits and the recent supply chain problems, there's been a roughly a Moore's law-like slope on the price of solar over, every 18 months or so. It's halved. Yeah, it's not quite that good, but it's pretty rich. And if you looked at that and you looked at the Midwest 7 years ago when I started this company, it was clear that at some point you'd be at what's called grid parity, where you can put power on the grid at the same price that is being put on through other sources of energy. And that has come to fruition. It is the cheapest power you can put on the grid now is solar. But there have been, between Trump putting tariffs on imported solar and between supply chain problems and decreasing tax credits, the Midwest has been rockier than I imagined, but I wanted to develop projects in the Midwest. But I also wanted to develop projects that would utilize my connections in the government and my knowledge of how government works. Our biggest success has been developing the first large project for the US Postal Service, and it's not in the Midwest, it's in Los Angeles, and we built 11, the team I put together, and I had another guy working with me in Megawatt at the time. We put together, developed an 11 megawatt urban solar project, which was at the time the largest urban solar project in the world. So my idea with Megawatt was to develop on brownfield sites, underutilized land. This fit in perfectly with what I wanted Megawatt to be. I wasn't so interested in big solar farms in cornfields or on pristine desert, but I got there eventually, and I'll tell you why.
So that 11 megawatt system, how many homes would that power?
So 1 megawatt went to the Postal Service to run that facility. The other 11 megawatts went to Los Angeles Water and Power. So it's their municipal utility essentially there. Mm-hmm. And the company we brought in and partnered with was a company that had gotten a contract to build, I think, 150 megawatts in the desert. This is 2016 when all this is happening, so still relatively little solar being built out there.
Right.
So, but part of the deal was they had to build 25 megawatts in the service territory, and I think Los Angeles Water and Power was thinking they were going to put up a whole bunch of small rooftop units versus go and cover the US Postal Service. So we'd gone in and met with the vice president for facilities, who has like 8,000 facilities under him at the Postal Service, and spent a lot of time coming up with this idea and putting together. And then we settled on Los Angeles, and we tapped into LA to find out who was going to want this power we were going to produce, because the Postal Service couldn't use it. And that's how we found the company that had the contract and pretty much brought the pieces together. And what was your initial question? Or ask me that again.
Well, I asked you how many 12 megawatt plant.
Oh, the number of houses,
the post
right?
office and the houses. I mean,
so the important thing to get is, number of houses has a lot to do with where those houses are. Right here, you've got a great need for air conditioning in a place like this, but most of our heating is probably natural gas heating, right? You've got other places like Phoenix where you're going all day long, but it also, you've got, what is the solar resource? You've got dry atmosphere in Phoenix.
Oh yeah, you got a lot of sun and a lot of long days.
So the number of houses in Iowa might be completely different than LA per megawatt. LA, it's probably 250 or so houses per megawatt. It's not
So
like
you get more efficiency with solar panels in LA than you do in Iowa because there's less cloudy days. And
yeah, a little further south, it's cloudy days. So it's the things that affect it really are atmospheric moisture and latitude. So the further south you are, the more direct shot the sun has at it for more of the year, and the more you produce.
So, as the visionary entrepreneur, you'd go and figure out, oh, there's an opportunity with the post office in LA, and then there's this other opportunity. You'd put the general scope of the project together, then you'd go find a financial partner that came in and with the capital to make it happen, or is that how that would work? Basically?
That's how that one worked. We actually found someone that already had a pre-existing contract with Los Angeles Water and Power that were ready. So that one makes it all look very simple. Let me tell you about the ones that don't work. So I spent years in Detroit. Detroit has 40 square miles of vacant lots and vacant buildings.
Right, lots of space for solar panels.
One would think. So this whole idea of utilizing brownfields and underutilized land and urban infill and government relations, and we worked this so hard. Came up with the idea before there were any, I think, microgrids. I mean, we read about that, didn't think of the idea of a microgrid, but came up with the idea of having a microgrid in Detroit and found partners there and identified a part of the city that everything would be powered off this islandable, meaning you can completely let it run on its own. Got Argonne National Laboratory, one of the DOE labs, signed up to do all the engineering, got HUD to commit part of a big grant they were giving to Detroit to the whole thing. Really years of running different ideas by the mayor's office, and I'll tell you, there's a little bit of solar on one of the places we identified that they let the utility, Detroit Thomas Edison is the monopoly utility there, go build solar on. Basically, they ate our lunch on that little piece of it, and Detroit Thomas Edison managed to get the money that was supposed to be earmarked for HUD for our project, or get our project, the feasibility study done on our project, to do a more broader study on how solar would work in Detroit.
Right.
There's a thing I refer to as study install. When you don't really want to do something, you can study the heck out of it. So the utility got the money pointed at.
So they basically found a way to take your idea and monetize it and cut you out.
Well, to make the city happen, who wanted some urban solar, the land we'd located, the utility said, well, no, we'll just do it ourselves. We won't work with them, we'll do it ourselves. And look, utilities have a lot of political sway, and generally if they want to do something like that, they can and they will. The whole thing with having the HUD secretary announce during a speech in Detroit that out of this, I forget if it was 8 or 11 or 13 million or something, grant that I think it was about 500,000 would go towards studying our initiative, and we're the ones that worked it in there. And the fact that, after a while, the mayor's office diverted that money to a study that answered questions we already knew the answers to. That one soured me on government relations challenges. If you've got to make your living by the outcome versus working on government relations because someone else is paying you. So that's when I started to look to the cornfields after that one.
So from Detroit to Iowa cornfields, and what made the Iowa cornfields attractive?
Well, a little bit of the bureaucratic challenges we found in trying to do other things here. I've worked on a brownfield site outside of Perry, Iowa for an awful long time, for years, maybe 8 years, trying to work with a big pork producer there to build a solar for them. City-owned land. Finally, the utility came in and built a little to satisfy the city and get them to shut up about it, a little 1 megawatt system on that land after we'd put years in. But here in our hometown of Iowa City, I've had dozens of meetings with the University of Iowa, the school board, with ACT, probably given 8 different plans to build surplus land, thereby ACT solar on it with the city of Iowa City, with the county. And generally what we hear is the utility, after spending a year or two of working with them, they go talk to the utility about it, and the utility will be, hey, we're giving them wind power. You don't really need to do this. And if you give people a reason not to do something, they generally will do it. I don't know if you know the high schoolers here in Iowa City, they occupied the superintendent's office, 3 or 4 years ago to force them to put solar on the schools, and that led to the city's study install. And by that point, their study showed that the best thing to do is to rely on use the renewable energy being provided by all the ample wind from the utility, which is great. I applaud the utility for that. And then if maybe have a couple small projects with the utility owning them at the different schools. Now, we had a plan to cover every one of the schools we could. We found a way to put solar on it here, and that all died. So after looking at that 4 years ago, I went south of town where the big substation that services the whole area is, and started looking at land down there, and decided, if you can't beat them, join them. Let's build a big utility project here and provide the power needed by the schools, by the university, by ACT, and by the residents of the community.
Just feed it right into the grid there at that big substation.
Work with the utility, and that's what we're doing now. And we've got 150 megawatt project in collaboration with the utility that we're developing that will provide enough power to power all the residences in Iowa City. So, some of the right idea comes out of the failures of the wrong idea, I guess. If the right idea is the one that works, right? So.
Well, congratulations on that. It sounds like that's moving forward and has a high probability of coming up.
We're delighted to be working with the utility on this one, and they are good partners, and they're the ones that have the money behind them to get it done. It's a $200 million-ish project, and they can use all the power, and they're delivering the power to the people here that need it. So it's still local power developed by local people, which was sort of one of our brands. We believe in distributed generation, and that you need to produce the power as close to the community as you can to create resiliency.
Yeah, I think a lot of communities would take some pride in knowing that they're doing something that's green and ecological and in the community to support the community.
Yeah, I think they do, and this is certainly a community that prides itself on being environmentally minded. But it was interesting to, when working with the smaller entities, not to find anybody that would take a big step forward, and they were happy to let the utility do it for them. So that's what they want. We plan to please.
Before we leave energy, I'm going to ask you to speculate a little bit based on your time in Europe, but with the whole thing with Russia and the Russian pipeline and the dependence that Germany and other countries put on Russian natural gas and oil. What do you see the opportunities and the shifts in terms of NATO independence from Russia, and how does that play out? Is it any time in our lifetime, or?
Well, I think it's being accelerated right now. I think there's a little chance we'll go back to the strong dependence on Russian gas that there has been in Europe. Right now, they're building import terminals to bring natural gas in. Germany, for instance, was very far ahead. 20 years ago, they were building solar everywhere. So they've already taken care of a bit of the problem. Where they ran into, I guess, the logjam here is not having a natural gas supply cut off quickly, but they're very focused on a renewable energy future over there. I think it will accelerate that, between that and create an import market that doesn't rely on Russia.
How much of that is solar versus wind?
Well, you'd think Germany has the factor that's put in the equation is called insolation, that looks at what the solar resource is. We talked about latitude and atmospheric moisture and snowfall and all the different things that affect. Germany has an insolation like, Buffalo, New York. It's really about as bad as it can get. And the fact that they've been able to build out as much solar as they have is impressive. I imagine they'll keep doing it. I think solar has more local appeal in densely populated areas because you get over the next hill, you don't see solar. You put up wind, you see it forever. You also are limited in where you can put wind. So I think solar is going to be, both in the U.S. and in Europe, a greater and greater part of the equation, just because NIMBYism, not in my backyard, on having a wind turbine there will restrict where they can go, as well as wind just doesn't always blow where you want it to and when you want it to.
Well, do you think Moore's Law will continue to drive down the cost of solar as fast as it has in the last decade?
I just don't know enough about that to tell you. I mean, I'd like it to. It would certainly make it. There's no reason why manufacturing shouldn't get better and better. The capacity, in some ways you're limited, but there's a lot of new materials they're working on, developing. I'd actually be interested to meet with some people at one of the national labs and see what is coming. I'm no longer really in the flow of that information. But, some breakthroughs are as simple as making them bifacial modules, which they've done recently, where they can get reflective energy from coming off the grass or snow, whatever's there. So most panels you get now are bifacial, right? That makes a big jump in efficiency and therefore lowers the cost per kilowatt hour of energy you're producing.
Yeah, I imagine at some point too, the technology to convert the sun's power into energy will get even more and more efficient. With a lot of energy coming that's lost and not being able to convert. So,
well, right now in our home state of Iowa, what is it? 60% of corn is going for ethanol, right? That is a very, very poor delivery system for energy. We think that photosynthesis as being the ultimate tool for capturing the sun's energy, but there's only a few weeks or months when that land is capturing energy, and it's very inefficient amount that's actually covered with blades of corn grass that can collect,
it probably doesn't have a good carbon footprint either.
That's right.
The cost to develop and the subsidies that are thrown into ethanol plants, I wouldn't even want to know, but they've got to be huge.
I ran well, you're right about the subsidies, but I think every form of energy is subsidized in one way or another. Ethanol certainly is, but for use of land, we could shut off all other generating in the state, all wind, all nuclear, all coal, all gas, and cover less than 1% of cropland with solar panels and provide all the energy used in the state here. Very little land, huge amounts of energy. Also, per acre of corn, you can take a 40 mile gallon car and run it about 10,000 miles. Put that in solar, get yourself a big old battery, put that all into a Tesla, you will go 1 million miles for an acre per year. So it's 2 orders of magnitude. If we're moving to it, we've already made a decision. Our farmland's being used for transportation. Let's do it effectively and do it with electric cars and solar instead of ethanol.
Right. Well, I think the last area I'd like to cover today, Sean, has to do with nature and your endeavors in beekeeping. And how did you get started with beekeeping, and what sparked your curiosity? And might tell us about some of the fun, visible things that have happened in Washington, D.C. as it relates to bees and honey production.
Well, beekeeping is my hobby, but we do have it set up as a business called Bee Curious LLC. We may have the largest apiary in the whole city. We get up to midsummer around 30 hives. We keep them at the the Swiss Embassy, and I say we because I've got a bunch of mentees. I will Thomas Sawyer anybody that wants to be Thomas Sawyer on beekeeping. So, but I've been very fortunate. I live 3 blocks away from the Swiss Embassy, and the Swiss ambassador's just been very generous with their space. But I got interested as a child. My preschool had a beehive. We used to watch them. There was a swarm in my neighborhood where I rode my bicycle through it and then watched as a beekeeper came to collect them, and always thought it was cool. And I really meant to have a life, as I mentioned, as a geologist and work outdoors and be in nature. And this whole Washington thing was a little curved, so I've always been looking for ways to get outdoors and connect with nature. And one of them is I work in my garden, and doing that I got stung by a hornet, and I started watching videos on hornets, and next thing the YouTube will take you right down the rat hole to everything else similar, and I'm watching beekeeping videos. I'm like, I always wanted to do that. So I tried to get in a beekeeping class, and it was full, so I just decided to teach myself. And there were things I didn't realize that were like, 5th year practices, like I've never bought a bee. All my bees I've caught in the wild when swarming or removed them from people's houses. My second bees were a structural cutout where they invaded some guy's porch, and I cut open the porch and removed them. Took them out. My first ones I caught in a swarm trap that I made and put up in a tree, and I'm very proud that Bee Curious, we're really a bee rescue, and all our bees are ones that have been caught in some phase of swarming or after they've been invaded a residence. Why is it important to catch them while they're swarming? Well, it's because it's a reproductive strategy. The swarm is basically the colony splitting, and half of them going to create new colonies. You got to think of the organism as the colony, not any particular bee, and all organisms have to replicate. So what happens is you get these swarms, and they're very vulnerable. They're outside the hive. They can get stuck in a storm. They can be eaten by something. They can be, killed with pesticides. It's said between maybe 20 and 30% of all swarms survive the first year. So it's getting them and getting
So it's a small percentage of the bees that when they split that actually survive.
Yeah. That's
wow.
Because they find a home that doesn't suit them, and then they don't get enough honey stored in there. They don't have enough space. They need the honey. The honey's not really for our enjoyment. It's there to run this furnace, this ball of bees that's right now out there, every beehive, vibrating. In the center of that's about 93 degrees, and that's where the queen is.
In the middle of winter when it's 20 below zero,
Exactly.
They're still vibrating and eating the honey. And
Yep, that's a honey-fired furnace. And so if they don't have enough honey, if they don't select a home that will let them store it, or something happens along the way, it's a high-risk thing. So we've been lucky enough to be able to capture a lot of swarms. Every year I've been doing it. Moved after the first year to the Swiss Embassy. Still keep a couple hives on my garage roof for protection and ornamentation, but they are, mostly there just to be able to see them come and go and focus on the Swiss Embassy. The ambassadors planted a pollinator meadow. The bees use a lot of water. In midsummer, every hive will be using a gallon of water a day. That means the bees have to go in their tiny little second stomachs, their honey stomachs, or crop, gather water and bring it back and forth. Very inefficient if you don't have a nearby water source.
Wow, that's amazing. I had no idea.
Yep, so they are. We've got a great setup there. Last year we won Washington, D.C.'s Black Box Honey Tasting Competition. This year, apparently, they let someone from Maryland enter who won it, which I think is cheating. We harvest honey. We had, last year, I think 700 pounds, 720 pounds. This year, about 580 or so. We sold 500 pounds, 1 pound jars. In an hour and a half, we announced a honey sell out the back gate of the Swiss Embassy. An hour and a half, 500 jars went, 1 jar per person limit. Year before, we moved 700 jars, started out the first hour with a 2-jar limit. After the first hour, we had to cut it to 1 hour, and 2.5 hours, they were all gone. So the neighborhood's very welcoming of the bees.
So what caused the production to go down from 700 to 500?
Oh, it just depends on how your colonies are doing, how many you overwinter. We did give away and sell off some colonies because we knew we'd be catching more colonies. New colonies you won't get much production out of, but also it's rainfall dependent, how if they get locked in during a big nectar flow because there's storms going on the whole time, they may not get it. Temperature, rainfall, season, maturity of the colony, lots of things can affect it.
Well, bees play a critical role in pollinating wildflowers and gardens and row crops and everything else. I hear things about the vitality and the impact of man and pesticides and everything else on bee crops. Do you have concerns about our honeybees and their future?
I think they are the linchpin right now because most of the crops that could be natively pollinated with native bees are long gone, and there's just too many of us not to have honeybees pollinating crops. Now, some crops like corn, they're windborne pollination. They don't really need the bees, but many fruits and vegetables need bees, and there's just not the native pollinator. We've wiped out the habitat of native pollinators. There probably weren't enough of them anyway, the way we have massive amounts of monocrops.
When you say native pollinators, what do you mean?
There's solitary bees, small colonial bees, there's butterflies, there's moths, there's all kinds of things, but they just don't have the horsepower to pollinate our industrial agriculture. And probably even if we went to a lot of small truck farms with a lot of varieties, we wouldn't be able to do it with native pollinators. So we've created a system where it's in some ways it's an invasive species, right? There were no honeybees here. They were brought over to Jamestown, the first colony. It used to be that every farm in America had them, both for pollination, but also it was the only way to get something sweet on your farm, unless you lived in maple sugar country or grew sugar beets. So people had bees, and they've spread through the country. They've locally adapted somewhat. New varieties have been brought over, of course, since Jamestown, but they aren't native. There are native pollinators, but they weren't designed, even if they had all their original habitat, to pollinate the way we grow crops now. So we need the honeybee. So they are in jeopardy because one of the biggest threats is actually the almond crop. 80% of commercial bees go to California to pollinate the almonds. So you wouldn't get a single almond unless the bees visited that flower that led to that almond. It's a massive use of water and of bees. We get all the bees there. There's a certain amount of drift where they don't make it back to the right colonies, so you can spread diseases through the whole. Now we haven't had that we know of a major problem yet, but you could spread a virus through all the bees in the country because bees are moved. Commercial beekeepers take them from the almonds to the apples to the strawberries. I can't tell you the order because it's not my business, but so we need the bees, but we also need to be careful of the bees. So you've got pesticides. We had a phenomenon a decade or so ago called, before I started beekeeping, colony collapse disorder. We're just wiping out colonies. It does not. There's other things that are wiping out colonies.
Genetic kind of defects, or
I'm not sure they ever got to the bottom of what created what at the time they were calling colony collapse syndrome. But there's still professional beekeepers that have 1,000 colonies. Some years they'll lose over the winter just from viruses and other things that came over 90% of the bees. There's a mite that came over called the varroa mite in the 1980s that changed beekeeping forever because it is everywhere in the world except for I think either New Zealand or Australia. It came over out of Asia. It looks like a tiny red tick, very small, size of a pinhead. and it attaches itself to the side of the bee and it sucks out, essentially, they call it the fat body, but it serves as their liver. So it makes them very susceptible to viruses. So if your mite load gets up over maybe 4 or 5% of your bees have it, you're very likely that your bees aren't going to be strong enough to make it through the winter and you'll just lose them. There's also a beetle that came over from Africa, the small hive beetle. There's a wax moth that came over in the 80s. So globalization changed the nature of beekeeping. It used to be, if you were a farmer in 1850, you could kind of just let your bees be until it was time to go collect your honey. Now there's a lot of pest management that goes on, and
Wow.
also it's made it a lot harder. So these things, and what's the next threat, right? But they don't have a diverse supply. If you pull out the fence lines and all the, they may not be prairie grasses, but the grasses and the native flowers and all have these big fields that are just a single crop. Doesn't give the bees a lot to work with, or a lot of season and variety to gather nectar. It's either get it all at once if there happens to be nectar and pollen in the monocrop, or get none.
Wow. Well, we've got a couple acres of gardens and forests, so I think maybe next time you're in Iowa during a warm spell, have you help us figure out how to get a couple beehives going and give them a healthy place to hang out.
Well, you need to focus, if you want to do it this year, on March is about the good time to be ordering your bees if you're going to buy them, or there's probably, starting about right now, the local beekeeping club has the beekeeping course usually. Since beekeeping, we consider starting in late March, you may have your first swarms and all. It kind of gives you, and you want to have your bees in and ready when the first nectar hits, because they got a short season. Iowa's great because you get a second nectar flow with goldenrod in the fall. So unlike DC, where we're done by mid-July, they've got what they're going to get, then it's a matter of keeping them from...
So I assume you have to have a suit, a net, if you're going to get into beekeeping, or do you even use one?
Well, I will tell you, I've been stung at least in 2022. I guess we're now 2023. 2022, over 200 stings at least.
Is that because you don't wear netting?
My first year, when I was super careful and only had a couple hives, I probably had 19 stings, just because things happen and you're around bees and you get one in your bonnet, or you take your bonnet off too soon, or you take your glove off and they get your finger. When you're being careful, you'll still be stung a little bit, and you really perfect your enunciation of the F word through that. But
love it.
but as you go on, you realize most of the time the bees are pretty gentle and they aren't going to sting you. And if they sting you, it's not the end of the world. And being out there in August, going through 20 beehives in a full bee suit is misery. So I generally start out, no matter what I'm doing, just with a baseball cap with a mosquito net over it, and sometimes I wear gloves or no gloves, and then kind of read the bees, and sometimes I can read them enough to, before they get super agitated, go and change, or wait to get stung a couple times and go change. But my mentees, and Erin, who's my senior mentee, so I should call her my partner now, make a lot of fun of me for how much stinging I get, or how stung up I get, because it's generally my own fault. But there's free medicine is what I always say when it happens. There's a whole thing of apitherapy where people go for various conditions and buy a whole tube of bees and get themselves stung to get what they think is medicinal. So we'll take it.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Sean, for your insights and your into the Ukraine, into entrepreneurship, into being an appointee in the Department of Energy, and all your adventures and travels. It's been enlightening and fantastic conversation. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Charles, for having me. It's been great.
Thanks for joining us on the AMPx Podcast. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Make sure not to miss future episodes, and please rate the show wherever you get your podcast. Thanks to our awesome production team, Lindsay Soderberg, social and digital marketing, Taylor Higgins, video production, and Seth Nielsen, marketing. See you next time.